Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome on in, everyone. Strike 95 here. And today, we're here in our beautiful 50 States, 50 Streams. This is the bonus stream, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying your day here today. And today, we're here in Boston and Logan International Airport. I hope you're all doing well here today. And today, we're going to learn more about our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. And we'll actually be able to learn quite a few of our nation's state capitals, of our national capitals for today. So I hope you're all doing well. And yes, this will be the final stream of the series. I know we started this back in New Year's Day. It was quite the adventure, for sure. But man, it's been an absolutely crazy series so far. We traveled to all 50 U.S. states, and now we're going to fly over to our nation's capital city, Washington, D.C. So before we get started, I do want to say hello to everyone here. I hope you're all doing well here today. Hello to all the lurkers and stuff. So we're going to go ahead and look about our flight plan this morning. So here's our morning's flight plan here for this morning. We'll start here at Logan International in Boston. We'll fly around downtown Boston. Then from there, we'll continue southwest to our first stop over at New York's LaGuardia Airport. Then from there, we'll fly across Central Park, the Empire State Building, downtown New York, the Statue of Liberty. Then we're going to go visit Princeton, then Waypoint in Trenton, then go to Philadelphia before making our second stop over to Smoketown Airport, just east of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Then from Lancaster, we'll visit York, Pennsylvania, then head down south over to Baltimore, Maryland. Then from Baltimore, we'll go to Annapolis, home of the U.S. Naval Academy. And then finally, we'll head over to our nation's capital of Washington, D.C. We'll fly over some of the D.C. landmarks here on our way. So if you notice, a lot of these waypoints have one thing in common. So these waypoints represent our nation's capitals over our past history. Yes, there have been 9 cities that previously have been the U.S. national capital before Washington, D.C. came. So that's why I want to do this bonus stream, because I wanted to talk about our nation's capital, even though it's not state. I still want to include their national capitals for that reason. So we're going to take the King Air B350 today. I think this would be a pretty good plane for the stream. The good old King Air, you can't go wrong with it. So we're actually here in Logan International Airport. So I need to get something. Let me go ahead and here it is, guys. Let me go hang. So Logan International is the main gateway to, it's the world's gateway to Boston, Massachusetts, the biggest and busiest airport in all of New England. Covers 2,300 acres, named after General Edward Lawrence Logan. Last year, over 43 million people have flown in and out of Boston International, which is actually a new record. It's continued to grow ever since, and it features destinations all across North America, Europe, South America, Asia, and the Middle East. It features destinations into into almost all continents but Australia. So really cool airport. Boston's one really neat airport. And speaking of Boston, Massachusetts, Boston is the capital and most populous city in all Massachusetts. It's the financial cultural center of New England. Population 675,000. Its metro area is around 4.9 million people, which is the 11th largest in the country, and it's one of America's oldest cities, founded in 1630 by Puritan settlers. And of course, Boston's home to many events in the American Revolution, including the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, the Battle of Bunker Hill and the Siege of Boston. And it still played a national role as a port, manufacturing hub, education, and cultural center. Of course, it's now a global leader of higher education research. A lot of people don't know this, but Boston was at one point one of the U.S.'s capital cities. In fact, Boston was at one point the capital of the United States. It had multiple national capitals over the years. That's the important part about Boston for all you guys here that want to learn more about Boston. But Boston's got a lot of really cool things in it. And I'll be heading back to Boston later in the year. So I'll be heading back to Boston later this month. So it's going to be pretty interesting to get back to Boston. Here we go. Hey, Red Baron, good to see you. We're here in the King Air. We're about to complete the final leg of our series. We're doing the bonus stream about our nation's different capital cities, and that's why we're here in Boston today. We're gonna fly over 5,000 feet. So I did forget to do something. Back when we did our 50 states, I did forget to do one thing. I forgot to post the pictures for the Hawaii trip. So unfortunately, I forgot to do that when I posted. I deeply apologize for that. But you guys can watch the VOD for the Hawaii trip. So thank you for the shout, Typhon. We're gonna fly over 3,000 feet. Here we go. We're gonna fly. Not the runway sign. I know. I know, right? Yeah, watch one of these get bogged down in the mud, Oshkosh. Oh, really? That's not good. Yeah, here's downtown Boston for you guys. You can see Independence Hall and all that around this area. You walk down the Freedom Trail and you get through all of this stuff. And we got bots. Great. Why do we have bots in this community? And of course, there's Fenway Park, home of the Red Sox. I've been there. Nice, great historic stadium for a baseball fan. Every baseball fan should come check out Fenway Park at least once. So we're gonna be heading our way down to our first stop here in the Guardian. I need to actually back to head. So we're gonna head down. This is 115 nautical miles over to the Guardian. We're gonna climb to 10,000 feet for this one. As we're gonna climb to 10,000 feet for this first leg. But remember, it's all flat scenery, so it's not really that big of a deal. So let's talk a little bit about Washington, D.C. for a bit. Let's go over our U.S. capital for a bit. So Washington, D.C. is where we're going to be covering here today, our nation's capital city. So let's talk about D.C. as we get to 10,000 feet. Our nation's capital is none other than Washington, D.C. Um, this capital city is located in the Potomac River across from Virginia and shares land borders with Maryland. It's named after, of course, our first president of the United States, George Washington, and the district's named for Columbia, the female personification of the nation. Of course, um, the origin of Washington, D.C. comes from the U.S. Constitution in 1789, which created a new federal district under the jurisdiction of Congress. So as a result, it is not part of any state, it is not one itself. And eventually, another act created it in 1790 to put it right in the Potomac River. And of course, this was one of our paved planned cities in the United States. But Washington, D.C. is important as it is the seat of our federal government. And it houses many buildings, including the U.S. White House, which is the residence of the president, the U.S. Capitol Building, Supreme Court Building, and multiple federal departments and agencies. In addition, it's home to many monuments and museums, including the Jefferson Memorial, Lincoln Memorial, and Washington Monument. There's also 177 foreign embassies here in D.C. And of course, it's also home to the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and Organization of American States, OAS. And finally, it is also one of our nation's top tourist destinations. over 20 million domestic visitors and 1.2 million international visitors visited DC in 2022, seventh most among all U.S. cities. But yes, Washington, D.C., definitely very interesting. But believe it or not, D.C. was not our nation's first capital. In fact, there was actually 9 different capital cities that came to be in the United States before Washington, D.C. In fact, all the places we're going to be flying today were all once at one point the national capital of the United States, which is why we're doing flight here today. Of course, before we get to that, let's talk a little about Washington, D.C.'s history for a bit, because we have a bit of a history lesson here in D.C. So, So before the Europeans arrived and before European settlers came to the United States, the Algonquin-speaking tribes of the Piscataway people inhabited present-day D.C. and lands around the Potomac River when Europeans arrived in the 17th century. Um, Also, you can find the Nacotchtank peoples by Catholic missionaries maintain settlements around the Anacostia River. A conflict between the European colonists and the neighbor tribes, ultimately displaced the Piscataway people, some which established a new settlement in Maryland. Of course, during the American Revolution, there were previously 9 other cities that served as capitals of the United States. And those 9 mentioned are Philadelphia, which was our first nation's capital, Baltimore, Lancaster, New York, Pennsylvania, Princeton, Annapolis, Trenton, New York City, and finally the current capital, Washington, D.C., are our nation's capital histories. Of course, it served as capitals between them. Following independence, briefly, New York was the capital before moving back to Philadelphia. Of course, the start of a new capital was found trying to start back in 1783 when the Pennsylvania Mutiny of 1783 forced the capital to move from Philadelphia to Princeton. Of course, Congress then considered a new location for it. Originally, some of which put on the banks near Trenton or the Potomac. And eventually, they tried to find a way to build a new capital. Of course, there have been many talks over it for the next couple of years, including in the Federalist in 43 in 1788 when James Madison argued for a new federal government the authority of its own national capital for its safety. Eventually, 2 years later, they eventually get a new act, the Residence Act in 1790, and they eventually found a new capital on the Potomac River. And under the Residence Act, the exact location was to be selected by George Washington. And eventually, Washington found a piece of land that was donated from Maryland and Virginia, which measures 10 miles on each side for 100 square miles. Of course, there were 2 pre-settlement settlements in the territory, Georgetown and Alexandria. And eventually, all those eventually became part of Washington, D.C. But eventually, of course, all after a survey, they built the new city. And eventually, 10 years later, in 1801, he officially organized the district and placed it under territory of the federal in control of the federal government. And is put into two counties: the county of Washington to the east and north, and the county of Alexander to the west and south. After residents of the citizens of D.C. were no longer residents of Maryland, Virginia, and the representative Congress ended. Of course, that's not. And if you think Washington D.C.'s history is quite peaceful, think again. See, there was this conflict called the War of 1812 between the Americans and the British. And of course, on a certain August night in 1814, August 24th, British forces invaded and occupied the city in the Battle of Bladensburg. And then, of course, the British troops set fire to the government buildings in the city, including gun in the U.S. Capitol, Treasury Building, and White House, known as the Burning of Washington. The damage of the city's burning could have been more extensive, but a storm forced the British to evacuate just 24 hours. Thankfully, most government buildings were repaired, but the Capitol was not completed until 1868. But yes, Washington, D.C. managed to completely avoid being burned down. Of course, then Washington, D.C. was on board with another issue. You see, Alexandria in the 1930s, the southern territory of Alexandria declined economically due to neglect from Congress. And it was mainly the fact that Alexandria was a major market for the domestic slave trade. Pro slavery residents feared the abolitionists would end slavery. So, as a result, Alexandria petitioned Virginia to retake the land, and eventually it happened, and Alexandria became back to Virginia. And it happened just 16 years later, and Alexandria is returned back to Virginia. And of course, this led to the Compromise of 1850, which outlawed slave trade in the district. Of course, during the U.S. Civil War, Washington, D.C., the Civil War led to the expansion of the federal government and notable city growth population, including a lot of free slaves that were freed by people of the South. Abraham Lincoln also signed the Emancipation Act in 1860, which ended slavery officially in the district, freed about 3,100 slaves in 9 months before his famous Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, African Americans gained the right to vote in the district in 1868. Of course, by 1870, the district's population grew around 75% to nearly 130,000 people. The city still lacked roads and paved roads and sanitation. So, of course, some members even thought about suggesting move it west, but USS Grant refused to consider the proposal. Of course, one interesting change that happened was, of course, some of the new growth. In 1888, the first motor streetcars began their service, and it introduced generating growth through the areas of the district beyond the original boundaries, leading to the expansion of the district over the next couple decades. Of course, it began, and of course, this led to Washington, D.C. getting an urban revival movement under this beautiful movement, which allowed to greater architecture, those of neoclassical and Beaux Arts architecture. increase the city's beauty and stuff. And again, there have been led to more spending in the 30s, led to new government buildings in the 1930s, museums, and memorials. Of course, one such issue was but however, it had to lead to cuts in welfare. During World War II, there was even more people moving down here to World War II because of federal employees working for the government during the war, and as a result, by 1850, it peaked at around 802,000 people. Of course, during our next... Oh. Alright, airspeed's dead. That's... Okay, the airspeed thing's up here, Typhon. I think you can read it up here. So that's probably why. Of course, after the Civil War ended, after the Civil Rights Movement happened, led to the 23rd Amendment of the United States, granting the district 3 votes in the Electoral College. For the election of president and vice president, however, the city's residents don't have much representation in Congress. Of course, JFK was assassinated in April 4, 1968. Afterwards, the riots broke out all across D.C. For the next 4 days, there were riots all over the city, which forced federal troops to have to get involved in D.C. to stop the violence. Many stores and other buildings were burned, and the rebuilding took at least over 2 decades until the late 90s for all of it to finally be rebuilt. Of course, in 1973, there's the D.C. Home Rule Act, which provided elected mayor and 13-member council for the district. And its first elected mayor was actually the first black mayor in Washington, D.C., Walter Washington. Of course, since the 80s, there have been attempts to make D.C. a state of the United States. However, while it has a lot of support from D.C. voters, it has not been successful in Congress, as it hasn't been through much of it, and it's still been debated even to today. But yes, that covers Washington, D.C. history of our nation's capital. If you wonder why it's dead, that's weird. I think it's a bug. I've been looking at the forums. It's still a bug. It doesn't have a P-top cover. I was expecting the aircraft. It didn't have a P-top cover. I checked. I checked the P-top cover. I checked all of it. It didn't have a P-top cover on it. It didn't have a P-top cover, so no, it had to be a problem. As I could always check the Yeah, that's the two Pitakus. It's clear. Well, we're not that far from getting down to New York City. We're actually pretty close. We're not actually that far from New York City. Get there pretty easy. But I can always check. But I think from what I've read, it's a bug. So before we get started, I do want to talk about some of the stuff, of course, about our other U.S. capitals. So the other U.S. capitals mentioned according to a document. So Philadelphia was the original U.S. capital on several occasions. And it was the capital of the U.S. while the one D.C. was getting built. Baltimore became the capital in 1776. And then afterwards, it was moved to Lancaster, New York. Lancaster was actually the capital for a day, but York held it for 9 months. Then it moved to Princeton in 1783 after Philadelphia. Then it was moved to Annapolis in 1784. And it was actually where the Treaty of Paris was reside. Then it moved to Trenton. It was the capital for a month. Then for 5 years, the government was in New York City before. And then finally DC. So we have all these different capitals. So there isn't too many news for me at least. For sports, obviously, Louisville City won last night for my hometown club. Louisville City won, so Louisville City 4-1 win, first place. Third Louisville City win. Nice win for Louisville City, of course. Um, in terms of other stuff going on, I think football season's going to be starting pretty soon. I think for some of the smaller leagues, it's already been started this past week. For the Bundesliga 2 happened for a couple days. Most notably, I'm keeping an eye on Schalke being 2-1 over Hertha Berlin. Pretty interesting stuff going on. we're flying over New Haven, Connecticut now. We're flying over New Haven. This is the home of Yale University, if you guys aren't aware about New Haven. The home of Yale. One of the nation's premier prestigious universities is Yale. So let's talk a little bit about Washington, D.C. for a bit. A little bit more about the geography and climate of Washington, D.C. Just to get a brief overview about our nation's capital. Washington, D.C., in terms of geography, the city has a total area of 68 square miles. 61 of those is land, and the other one's water. And it's bordered by various counties in Maryland, like Montgomery County to the northwest, Prince George's County to the east, Arlington County to the west, and Alexandria to the south. The highest natural elevation in the district is 409 feet above sea level at Fort Reno Park in upper northwest DC. There are very many parks, gardens, squares, circles around Washington, and there's about 683 parks in DC, comprising about 7,000 acres. In fact, most of the acres of the city land is managed by the National Park Service, including Rock Creek Park, which at one point used to be a national park. Believe it or not, it's actually one of our urban parks. It was actually once a national park established in 1890. And it's home to a variety of plant and animal species. There's also other park service properties like the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, the National Mall, and Anacostia Park. And of course, you cannot forget all about the different parkland and all that here at the capital. The climate of DC is temperate with humid subtropical climate. Winters are cool to cold with some varying intensity, while summers can be hot and humid. Of course, the summers are hot and humid with the daily average temperature in July 79 degrees, humidity around 66 degrees. Heat indices regular approach can be up to 100 degrees in the summer, and as a result, that humidity can bring thunderstorms in this area. Blizzards also affect DC during the winter, every 4 to 6 years on average, and the most violent storms, nor'easters, can impact the larger regions of the coast. One of those being in 1922, received 20 inches of snowfall. Hurricanes or the remnants can impact the area late in summer, but they're usually weak by the time they reach Washington. The highest recorded temperature here in DC was 106 degrees in 1918 and 1930. The lowest recorded temperature was negative 15 during the Great Blizzard of 1899. So yeah, not that cold. But temperature isn't even that hot compared to some of the other hottest temperatures. So it's not that bad. Alright guys, we're going to be approaching New York City shortly. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to start the descent down to 2,000 feet. We're going to slowly descend. Guys, I hope you're having your good weekend. I hope you guys had a great weekend so far. Here in our series. I hope you guys are having a good weekend. For me, my weekend's going pretty good. all doing well. So I hope there's going on as well. So yeah, if you guys aren't aware, next week will be the start of two of our new series. On Friday, we'll start the all-country series in Afghanistan. We'll be going from Herat over to Kabul. And then for Sunday, we'll do a prologue of our America's National Park streams. We'll cover each of our U.S. national parks. And we'll be starting with a prologue about the history of the National Park Service as we fly our way from Boise over to Butte. Prepare us for the stream into Yellowstone National Park. So we're going to be landing in New York City very shortly. So we're going to go ahead and cover our next slide here. Let's talk about New York City, New York, NYC. The most popular New York City is our nation's most populous city, located in the southern tip of New York State, on one of the world's largest natural harbors. The city comprises of 5 boroughs, each with its own respective county, and is both the geographic and demographic center of the Northeast megapolis in the New York metro area, and is a global center of finance, commerce, culture, technology, entertainment, and media, as well as arts, fashion, science, and academics, and is the home to the headquarters of the United Nations. Its estimated population is about 8.47 million people, distributed over 300 square miles, and it's the most densely populated major city in the country. Yes, this tiny little city has got double the population of Los Angeles, and over 20 million people live in the metro area of New York City, and 23 million in its statistical area, both the largest in the United States, and is one of the world's most populous mega cities. Of course, around 800 languages are spoken in New York City, making it the most linguistically diverse city in the world. And it can trace its origins back to Fort Amsterdam, and it was founded by Dutch colonists, actually founded this area originally as New Amsterdam. Of course, the British took over it in 1664, and it was renamed New York. Of course, New York is one of the premier world financial and fintech centers, anchored by Wall Street in the financial district. New York City can generate a economy of $2 trillion generated in New York City. $2 trillion, which makes its economy larger than all but 9 countries on Earth. So yes, New York City, definitely one of the great cities in the United States. Of course, New York City is home to tons of landmarks in the city. You have parks such as Central Park, the Statue of Liberty, the most famous landmark in the city, Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building. Um, you have the 1776 Tower, Times Square, Brooklyn Bridge, and more. Tons and tons of all. And we'll be landing in LaGuardia, which is the main New York airport for domestic flights. Is LaGuardia? It's mainly used for domestic flights. And it was opened back in 1929. It opened as a public airport in 1939, named after the former mayor Fiorino H. LaGuardia. Over last year, over 33 million people flew in and out of LaGuardia Airport, making it the nation's 19th busiest airport. It's uniquely structured due to its slot system and curfew and perimeter rules, which prevent a lot of nonstop flights from more than 1,500 miles. Historically, it had poor, outdated. It was criticized for outdated facilities, air operations, poor customer services, but they're now renovating the place to make it a lot more nicer and more up to date. And it features destinations all across the United States, from small flights in the Northeast to flights the eastern half of the United, to flights all across the country. And I can list a ton of them. But LaGuardia flies to so many destinations. So, tons of really cool stuff. I see LaGuardia right ahead of us. LaGuardia. Here we go, guys. Our first landing here in New York's LaGuardia Airport. stop right. We'll stop right here for a bit. I turn on visual assist. There's no PyTalk to the Zero Typhon. So this is a bug. This is not a. So we'll park here for a bit. Want to join our next leg of the flight. Of course, we'll be in New York City very shortly. The Big Apple, so going to New York City very shortly. If you guys want to join on in, we're in the Southeast Asia server. If you guys want to check out our route. Server. Let's go ahead and get over to New York City. So this here is New York City, everyone. Here's Central Park. Of course, from here we can see the famous Empire State Building, but there are tons of buildings here in this city. It's crowded with skyscrapers everywhere. Look, there's the Empire State Building to Empire State Building here. Here it is, guys. New York City. There's the World Trade Center. Here's the Statue of Liberty down below us. Statue of Liberty. Let's go over a few more slides of DC as we head over to um our next waypoint being in filled. Our next waypoint would take us to Princeton. But before we do that, I want to go over briefly about Washington D.C. So you see, Washington D.C. was a planned city, and many of the street grids were developed in that plan, and it was commissioned by Pierre Charles L. Effant, a French-born military museum artist, to design the capital, and he listed the help of quite a few famous surveyors and planners to help lay out the city. He also, and of course, the capital has been divided into four main areas: northwest, northeast, southeast, and southwest. And the axis bounding the quadrants radiate from the U.S. Capitol building. Of course, the city of Washington is bordered by quite a few boundaries and stuff. And many of the government buildings, monuments, and museums along the National Mall were heavily inspired by classical Roman and Greek architecture, but define much of the city's landscape. In fact, you can see some of this from its most famous monuments. And that includes the Jefferson Memorial, Lincoln Memorial, Washington National Memorial, and all that were heavily inspired by all of the buildings. Of course, much and economically speaking, Washington D.C. Is mainly anchored by that of the federal government. Is by far the biggest employer is the federal government. The Washington metro area is the 8th largest metropolitan economy, thanks to its diverse economy based on professional business services, tourism, entertainment, and government making a big part of its economy. More than 25% employed in D.C. were by the federal government as of July 2022, and its GDP per capita was at the very top at $160,000, which is 3 times greater than that of Massachusetts. And of course, Washington is a leading center of all sorts of national and international research organizations, making research very important. And of course, tourism is actually the city's second largest industry, with 18 million visitors coming to DC thanks to its historic buildings, monuments, museums, sport events, and more, making DC a very much a visited city for tourists. That's something to keep in mind about Washington. So our first waypoint will be, we'll cover the next 2 waypoints very shortly since they're pretty close to each other. Our first waypoint is in Princeton. Now, of course, Princeton was actually once U.S. capital, was Princeton. Now, Princeton, everyone should probably know Princeton from our New Jersey stream, but Princeton is very famous as a college community here in New Jersey, home to Princeton University, one of the most acclaimed research universities in the world, founded in 1766. But this borough actually has a population of 30,000 people. And it's equidistant to both Philadelphia and New York City. And throughout much of its history, it was split into 2 different municipalities, a township and a borough, but it was officially merged in 2013. Some of the really cool points of interest here include the Nassau Christian Center, of course, Princeton University, the Albert Einstein House, where he lived until from 1936 to his death in 1955, and Drumthwacket, the official residence of New Jersey's governor. But a lot of really cool places in Princeton, really cool college town. It was the nation's capital at one point. It was actually once the nation's capital during the American Revolution. Of course, it was then later moved down from here to nearby. It was once the capital in 1783. Of course, then it was moved over to Trenton. Then we move over to Trenton, which is right nearby, is the city of Trenton, New Jersey. Trenton is actually currently New Jersey's capital city. It was also once the capital for about a month, just over a month, in 1784. But this city borders the Philadelphia metro area to the west, in New York. Population is around 9,000 people, and it dates back to 1719 when it was made of a constable. Of course, Trenton historically had a strong manufacturing industries with factories producing steel, iron, rubber, pottery, and other products to serve the nation. Nowadays, it's the government that's in charge of the economy, obviously, is government industry. A lot of the development was spurred back in the 19th century with the Delaware and Red Tank Canal and Camden and Amboy Railroad. For a lot of development. Nowadays, some of the most iconic landmarks in Trenton include the New Jersey State Museum, the State House, the Trenton War Memorial, the William Trent House, which is the oldest building in the city, and the Old Masonic Temple. We'll fly over both Princeton and Trenton here very shortly. And that is before we're going to head over to Philadelphia. Here we go, guys. We're going to get to Princeton very shortly. There's Princeton. Hey, Diddy. Diddy XXO. Oh, thank you for the follow. Uh, what an unfortunate username thing. We're gonna get to Trenton. So after we get to Trenton, we'll cover the next major city, and that is Philadelphia. Of course, it's the most populous city in Pennsylvania, the nation's sixth most populous city with 1.6 million people. Metro area is around 6.3 million people, and it's world renowned for its culture, cuisine, and history, influence on business, industry, and more. This city is an old one, 1682, founded by William Penn, an English Quaker and advocate for freedoms, and is the capital of colonial Pennsylvania. It played a big role in the American Revolution and Revolutionary War as the central meeting place for the nation's founding fathers in the Continental Congress, which eventually led to the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the U.S. Constitution in 1789. Of course, in terms of capitals, Philadelphia served as our capital on 4 separate occasions until 1800 with the building of Washington, D.C. Nowadays, Philadelphia is home to many firsts: the nation's first library, hospital, medical school, national capital, university, central bank, stock exchange, zoo, and business school. Yeah, there's tons. Yes, and that's why I I know what that means. Yeah, the negative connotations. I wonder where that came. So here's Trenton, New Jersey. Here's the capital of New Jersey, Trenton. And now we're heading down to Philadelphia. We're gonna head down to Philly. And we're gonna talk more about Washington, D.C.'s culture for a bit. We're going to be heading to Philadelphia very shortly. And we're heading down to Philadelphia. Once we head to Philly, we're going to head over to Smoketown Airport and land at Sierra 37, just right outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia's coming up very shortly, guys. So here it is, guys. Welcome to Philadelphia. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Here it is, guys. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Welcome to Philly. Let's talk about the culture of Washington, D.C. for a bit. Yes, I know a lot of you thinking it's all government and stuff, and Washington, D.C. all know about that. But D.C.'s actually more than that. See, Washington, D.C.'s culture not is a reflection of its status as the capital of the U.S. and the presence of federal government, its large black population, and its role as the largest city in the Chesapeake Bay region. Of course, the U.S. federal government played an instrumental role in developing many of the cultural institutions throughout the city, such as museums and performing arts centers. The city's historic black population also drove many cultural activities and artistic pursuits. For example, the U Street corridor in D.C. became the important center of African American culture that's still prevalent even here today, after all these years. And one big part of it, how Washington grew, is the arts. As DC is a national center of the arts, home to several concert halls and theaters. Most notably, the JFK Center for the Performing Arts is home to our National Symphony Orchestra, the Washington National Opera, and the Washington Ballet. And of course, some of these are some of the most renowned in the entire country. Of course, you can also find the Ford's Theater here in DC, which is where Abraham Lincoln was unfortunately assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in April 14, 1865. But still today is a theater and a museum. And you can also find the Marine Barracks, which is home to the Marine Band, which is the oldest professional music organization in the country. Of course, in 1950, you found Arena Stage, and it's now gaining international attention. It's spared a lot of its independent theater movement. And there are plenty of other great theater arts. Of course, the U Street corridor is home to Howard Theater and Lincoln Theater, which hosted music legends such as DC natives Duke Ellington, John Coltrane, and Miles Davis. And it's rich in African American music history. In terms of music, DC has a really rich music history. Columbia Records was founded actually in DC, and it's one of the biggest music records in the United States in the recorded sound. Of course, the city grew into one of America's most important music cities during the early jazz age, thanks to DC native Duke Ellington, becoming one of the most prominent jazz composers and musicians of his time, and began his career here in DC. But there were also its own genre called go-go, a post-funk percussion driven flavor of rhythm and blues that was popularized by DC bandleader Chuck Brown. And of course, nowadays, it's well known for its indie music heritage, thanks to DC-based label Discord Records. And they formed the important in the labels of 1980s punk and indie rock of the 90s, as well as many indie music venues like the Black Cat and Night Club bring many popular acts to the area. So yes, DC has a rich music history. I know some people kind of gets overlooked sometimes. It's actually pretty important. In terms of cuisine, again, is rich in fine and casual dining. It's one of the best cities in the country for dining. It has a diverse range of restaurants and a wide variety of cuisines, including that of Chinatown. But of course, DC is one of the best cities in the world to find Ethiopian cuisine because of all the Ethiopian immigrants that arrived into Washington, D.C. And they brought in their diverse cuisine over to the United States. And particularly, Shaw neighborhood is potentially you can find a lot of those restaurants. And you can find tons of food trucks. Of course, among the Washington, D.C. born foods is the half smoke. Half beef, half pork sausage placed in a hot dog style bun topped with onion, chili, and cheese. Also, birthplace of mumbo sauce, similar to barbecue sauce but sweeter. And it's also popularized for the jumbo sliced pizza, which is a large New York style pizza, but it's huge. And of course, the signature restaurant is Ben's Chili Bowl. And it's a peaceful escape for a lot of people, famous for its chili dogs, half smoke. And of course, as of 2024, 25 restaurants have received stars in the DC Michelin Guides, which is actually the most stars per capita of any U.S. city. And third most in the world. Yes, Washington, D.C. is one of your finest, is one of the finest restaurants, foodie cities in the country, is D.C. And of course, there are also tons of museums. Where do I even begin with the museums here? Some of the most popular and visited museums in the country are here in DC. Most notably, the Natural History Museum and National Gallery of Art are two of the most visited in the entire country. And Washington has 8 of the 28 most visited museums in the country. There are tons of Smithsonian museums, which was actually found by Congress, and there's tons of Smithsonian museums. We all know the Natural History Museum is the big one, but there's also the National Air and Space Museum, National Museum of African Arts, American History Museum, National Museum of the American Indian, and the Smithsonian Institution Building. And there's plenty of other great museums that are more privately operated. The National Building Museum is a big one. The National Museum of Women in Arts, the Phillips Collection, DuPont Circle, and more. All found in Washington. Vast museum. And finally, of course, is Washington, D.C.'s sports heritage of Washington, D.C. Now, there are 4 professional men's sports teams and 2 major women's teams in the Washington, D.C. area. The most popular team in the district is Major League Baseball's Washington Nationals. As of 2019. And it opened back in 2008. They played at Nationals Park, which is right in the district. Really cool stadium, though. Nearby is in Landover, Maryland. You can find the Washington Commanders, formerly the Skins. But the Washington Commanders play in Landover at Northwest Stadium, which is an absolutely terrible stadium. It's one of the worst in the entire. It's the worst stadium in the NFL. It's garbage. Thankfully, though, the Commanders are going to be moving to a much better stadium in DC, which is a far better stadium. In downtown DC. Then you have the Washington Wizards and the Washington Capitals. They play in the Capital One Arena. And then the Mystics and play in the Care First Arena, which is purpose-built for that. DC United and Washington Spirit played Audi Field. And the city's teams have won a combined 14 professional championships throughout their respective histories. The most successful of those have been the Washington Commanders, winning 2 NFL championships in Super Bowls. Then you have the DC United with 4 titles, and then the other teams have one each. There's also 4 Division I teams: the American University Eagles, the Revolutionaries of George Washington University, Georgetown, the Hoyas of Georgetown University, and the Bison of Howard University. So yes, there are quite a few really cool sports teams here in this city. So definitely some pretty cool stuff. Definitely a lot to talk about here with Washington. But yes, if you guys don't know, Washington Commanders are going to be able to build a new stadium on the site of RFK Stadium. They're going to finally replace that abandoned stadium with a brand new facility. Looks amazing. I'm very excited for the Washington fans to get a brand new facility. They definitely deserve it. Because Northwest Stadium is a complete dumpster. It is a horrendous stadium. I mean, it is one of the worst in the. I mean, it had. I mean, water leak issues. But thankfully, they're going to finally get a new facility. Replace that derelict stadium in our. About time they get a new facility. So Smoketown Airports to our left. We're going to prepare for the landing here. Here it is, guys. first stop, our second stop of the day here. So here we are, guys, on our second stop, Smoketown Airport. We'll take a break here for about a minute or two before we take off. Hey, Planet Neutral, good to see you here. I hope you're doing well, my dude. So we're exploring all their nation's previous capitals as we make our way from Boston over to DC. We just arrived our second to last stop of the day. So before we take off the air, we're going to be flying over two cities, and they're really close to each other. So I'm going to talk about Lancaster, which is where we're at nearest to. Lancaster is population 58,000. It's the most populous city of Pennsylvania. It was settled back in the 1720s. It's one of the oldest inland cities in the United States, and it once served as Pennsylvania's capital from 1799 to 1812. Primarily focused in healthcare, tourism, public administration, manufacturing, and professional, semi-professional services. But yes, Lancaster was at one point the temporary capital of the United States for one day in 1777 at the courthouse. And it was for one day on September 27, 1777, after Continental Congress fled Philadelphia, still captured by the British. However, after that, then they moved it further west to York. But the city was pretty cool, though, because Lancaster was home to several important figures, including the 15th President James Buchanan, and you can find his estate in Wheatland, on which the picture you see here on your screen is Wheatland. You can also find Thaddeus Stevens, one of the most powerful members in the U.S. House of Representatives at the time, lived here as an attorney. And of course, you can also find Robert Fulton, who created the first fully functional steamboat in the United States, as well as being a major iron foundry center that produced many iconic innovations were found here in Lancaster. Pretty cool stuff. It's a very historic city, and it kind of gets overlooked. Now, to the west is York. Now, York is a city, 44,000 people. It was founded in 1741, and it was the temporary base for the U.S. Continental Congress from 1777 to June 1778. Of course, and then in which the Articles of Confederation were drafted, which led to the claim that this was actually the first capital of the United States, even though historians disagree with that. But of course, York is a pretty cool city as well, and there's some really cool landmarks, including the Golden Plough Tavern, the General Horatio Gates House, the York Meeting House, the Billmeyer House in 1863, and more. And you can find the historic York State Fair, which is claims to be the country's oldest state fair, dating all the way back to 1765, and it runs every year in late July for 10 days. But yeah, really cool city, both pretty historic and really unique communities. So guys, let's go ahead and prepare for the final leg. And if you're wondering why airspeed's dead, it's a bug. It's a bug with the sim. It's not anything I did. So here is Lancaster. And now we're gonna fly over to York across the Susquehanna River here today. We're gonna fly over here, fly over to York, and then we're gonna head down over to Baltimore. York's gonna be our next, and then once we turn left, we're gonna turn left at 184 degrees, and we're gonna head over to Baltimore for a bit. So, yeah, this is the flash stream of this series, guys. I can't believe this is over pretty. Here's York, Pennsylvania. York. Right ahead of us is York, Pennsylvania. This is York. Here's York. Go ahead and turn left. Let's talk a little bit about Washington, D.C. right now. Let's finish up some of the D.C. slides. So in terms of local government, Washington, D.C., Article 1 of Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution grants the U.S. Congress exclusive jurisdiction of the city, and it did not have elected local government until the passage of the 1973 Home Rule Act. Over almost 200 years later, which devolves certain congressional powers to elected mayor and 13-member council. However, Congress retains the right to review and overturn laws by the council. As a result, Washington, D.C. is overwhelmingly Democratic and having voted Democratic presidential since gained votes in the 1960 election. 8 of the city's wards each elect a single member of the council, and residents elect 4 at-large members to represent the district as a whole. The council chair is also elected at large, representing its voting rights. In the city, it reserves all federal holidays and celebrates Emancipation Day on April 15th, which ends slavery in the district. And of course, one important part is the idiom inside the Beltway references a lot of the political issues inside DC. In terms of transportation, there's about 1,500 miles of streets, parkways, and avenues here in the city. Due to the freeway revolts in the 60s, much of the proposed interstate highway system through the middle of DC was never built. I-95 is the major East Coast highway, bends around the district, form the Capital Beltway. And of course, Washington, D.C. is notorious for being one of the world's worst road congestions in the nation. Of course, it's a major cycling city now. As of May 22nd, it expanded this expansion of its bike network to over 104 miles of bike lane network. And a lot of these were protected bike lanes. It's part of the Capital Bike Share program, which has the largest bicycle sharing programs in the country. And it's one of the most walkable cities in the country. Of course, in terms of rail transportation, Washington, D.C. operates Washington Metro, which is the second busiest rapid transit system in the country. And it serves Washington, D.C. and its Maryland, Northern Virginia suburbs. And finally, in terms of airports, there are three major airports that serve the district, but none of them are within the city. The closest is Ronald Reagan National Airport, just in Arlington County, Virginia. Other two airports that serve the district. First is north of DC, Baltimore Washington Airport, and finally to the west is the international airport for international flights, Dulles, which serve the city. So pretty cool stuff here. Let's talk a little bit about Baltimore, Maryland coming up. So Baltimore is Maryland's most populous city, population 585,000 people in 2020. Its metro area is around 2.8 million people. And of course, this independent city was designated as an independent city in 1851. And Baltimore has been around as a major city since 1729. At one point, it was home to the nation's oldest railroad, the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad, and cemented Baltimore as a major transportation hub, giving producers in the Midwest Appalachia access to the port. And it was a major trade port. Also, where the Star Spangled Banner was made. When Francis Scott Key wrote the poem during the Battle of Baltimore in 1812, and eventually became our national anthem in 1901. Of course, it was also at one point the capital of the United States. Before we returned to Philadelphia. Of course, many neighborhoods in Baltimore have a rich history, including that Fells Point, Federal Hill, and Mount Vernon. And in fact, Baltimore has more public statues and monuments per capita than any U.S. city in the country. But yeah, Baltimore, really cool city. Sadly, I know crime has been a big problem in Baltimore over the last decade or so. Crime has been an issue, sadly, in Baltimore. It's one of the most dangerous cities, which is a real shame because Baltimore definitely has a rich history, lots of strength and culture. It's a really good sports town too, with especially baseball. So we'll fly over Baltimore, then we'll cover Annapolis, Maryland. Then we'll be going over to DC's most famous monuments. Let's see who's around. We can check out in the future. So next to Baltimore, of course, is Annapolis, which is further south. Now, Annapolis is actually Maryland's state capital. It's a very old city. In fact, it was served the seat as the Confederation Congress and the temporary national capital from 1783 to 1774. And of course, this was also where the Treaty of Paris was signed. But Annapolis has been around since 1969. And of course, this is where you can find the U.S. Naval Academy as well. But Annapolis, cool city. Of course, the Naval Academy is a big part of Annapolis, where our finest Navy cadets have been trained here to serve the U.S. Navy. But it's definitely a pretty cool area as well. Annapolis, really neat city, a lot of history here. Here's Baltimore. Here's Baltimore. There we go, downtown Baltimore, and you can find Fort McHenry down here too. All the way down here is Fort McHenry, where they did the Star Spangled Banner. So here is Annapolis, guys. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about some of the DC monuments as we get over to Washington, D.C. So there are four main monuments I will want to talk about here today. The first is the U.S. Capitol Building. This is where you find the U.S. Congress. It's the seat of the U.S. Congress. It was located at Capitol Hill in the east end of the National Mall. And of course, the U.S. Capitol forms the origin point of the street numbering system of the district and its four quadrants. It was completed back. It was started in 1793. It was completed in 1800, but eventually it didn't get its last extension until 1963. Of course, some of these were partially destroyed by the 1814 burning of Washington, but they were fully restored in 5 years, and they continued to build it up in the 1850s by extending the wings, and eventually it was completed in 1963. The massive dome on top of it is 288 feet high and 96 feet diameter. Of course, There have been and of course, the general public has paid numbers of individuals lying in state capitol, including former presidents, senators, and our officials throughout its long history. Um, Many of these included officers like Jacob Chestnut and Josh Gibson, who were killed in the 1998 shooting incident. It also paid respect to Rosa Parks during 2005, and in 2018, Billy Graham lied in honor of the rotunda. It's also where you can find, of course, the presidential inaugurations every 4 years. It's held here in the U.S. Capitol building. The second landmark we'll be flying over today is the U.S. White House. This is the official residence of the President of the United States. It has served the residents ever since John Adams came here in 1800 when he moved the capital from Philadelphia. The residence itself was designed by an Irish-born architect, James Hoban, and he modeled the building after the Leinster House in Dublin. And it was constructed between 1792 to 1800, and they were made of Aquila Creek sandstone painted white. Of course, the mansion was set ablaze by the burning of Washington in 1814, which destroyed much of the interior and the char in the exterior, and they reconstructed ever since. Of course, the White House today now comprises of a few: the executive residence, the West Wing, East Wing, the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, which previously served the State Department and other departments, and the Blair House, which is the guest residence. Now it's a National Heritage Site and owned by the National Park Service. But yeah, there's some really interesting stuff, and security has always been pretty. Pretty cool stuff. And then, of course, the next is the Washington Monument, which was an obelisk built to commemorate George Washington. This was it was built between 1848 to 1854, and it was later reconstructed in 1887 to 1888. This obelisk is one of the tallest freestanding structures in the world, 500 foot tall, surrounded by a 55 foot tall pyramidion. At one point, this was the tallest stone structure in the world and the tallest obelisk. And it's the third tallest column in the world, only trailed by the one in Pyongyang and the San Jacinto Monument in Texas. I flew over Annapolis while I was busy. Yeah, guys, this here is Annapolis behind us. My apologies. My apologies, guys. I was busy. See, this is the one problem with taking a fast plane like this sometimes. I forget what. And of course, they did have to rebuild it in 2016 to fix soil contamination and repairing the elevator. And the last of the Washington, D.C. landmarks we'll be flying over today is the Pentagon. This was the headquarters building of the U.S. Department of Defense. It was constructed and accelerated during World War II, and it was a symbol of the U.S. military, and it's often used as a medallion for it. And it was designed by American architect George Bergstrom, and it took only 2 years for this thing to get completed. They completed this for World War II. Of course, this is the world's second largest office building, with 6.5 million square feet of floor space. Over half of it is used for office space. It features 5 sides, 5 floors above ground, 2 basement levels, and 5 green corridors per floor to bring over 17 miles of corridor. It's the Pentagon. And around 23,000 military civilian employees work in the Pentagon. Of course, infamously, the Pentagon was damaged during the September 11 attacks, when 5 Al-Qaeda hijackers flew American Airlines Flight 77 to the western side of the building, which killed themselves and 184 people. 59 of them on the plane, 125 in the Pentagon. And it was the first foreign attack on the federal facilities in the Capitol since the War of 1812. So, in 2009, they put an outdoor memorial to dedicate the people who suffered of the victims in the Pentagon. Pretty touching. Hey, Quartz, good to see you. And our last stop today is Ronald Reagan National Airport, and that is our last stop. This is one of the 3 airports, and this is the closest one to our nation's capital. Opened back in 1941 as Washington National Airport. It serves 98 non-stop destinations in the United States and internationally. And it's one of the 25 busiest airports in the U.S., as in 2024, it served 26 million passengers. Of course, in recent years, there's faced a lot of controversy over safety accidents, because yes, there has been quite a few safety accidents around this airport in recent years. And it has flights from all across the country flying into D.C. One interesting thing about DCA is the restrictions. It has some of the strictest noise restrictions in the country, and with security issues, pilots have to approach the river visual, one of the more unique approaches in the aviation world. They have to, and it's only possible with the ceiling at least 3,500 feet and good visibility. And as a result, it's a very tricky approach. So, if you ever get to DCA, you're probably familiar with it. And I've done this approach a few times. It's a really interesting one. For sure. I've done this a few times with the PMDG 737 family. Here we are, guys. There's the terrible rubbish Northwest Stadium, which is complete rubbish. It's terrible. Thankfully, they're going to build a new stadium where RFK Stadium was at. So this is DC. Well, a little bit. We approach the nation's capital. But yeah, we're about to end this series, Quart. This is the final stream of the series. Very excited to get this series wrapped up. guys. Here's the former RK Stadium. That's now going to probably be the new home of the Washington Commanders. I know normally you can't fly this low around DC, but this is the flight simulator. I think you can make exceptions for that. So here is the Capitol building here in DC, or what it would be if the simulator actually showed it in plain. Here's what the Capitol building would be. That's baked into the scenery. Gonna be handy. So this here is the National Mall, of course. There's all of this stuff in the National Mall. The White House. I don't get what the DC photograms be back like this. So here's the White House. That is very weird. There's the Jefferson Memorial. Where's the Washington Memorial? I guess the Pentagon's here. That's weird. Some of the stuff's not sure. That is definitely pretty weird. Here it is, guys. Our last landmark. The U.S. Pentagon. World's second largest office building. But, I mean, it's the Pentagon. What do you expect? One of the most famous landmarks in this. Here we go, guys. Our last stop of the day. And the last stop of the series, guys. We're back in D.C. Washington National Airport. Here we go, guys. Go ahead and wrap this thing up. So guys, that is it over, guys. It's finally over. After 51 streams, 50 states, and a bonus D Capital stream, we're officially wrapped up this series, guys. Thank you guys for spending over the past 8 months with us. I hope you guys enjoyed this series as much as I do. I'll post this video into the VODs channel on Monday. So thank you guys all so much for being here today. So before we wrap up, we're going to go ahead and raid a good friend of ours. We're going to raid Kaharia. I believe today's her birthday, so we're going to go ahead and raid her stream. So guys, we'll be back to start our new series next Friday in Afghanistan for our new country series. So I hope you guys have a great time, and see you all very soon. Take care, everyone, and have a great rest of